Today's presentation will be from Jack Freestone, and he is going to be presenting around GHB experiences and cultures of practice amongst LGBTQ people. Before I let Jack speak, just a word about him. He's currently enrolled with his PhD over at the Kirby Institute. And he's also working as a coordinator of drug and alcohol research over at ACON, and I'm sure we'll have plenty of experiences to share from his research across both of those aspects of his career to date. So without any further ado, I'll hand it over to you, Jack.
Thanks so much, Chris, and thank you very much, Daria, for having me to speak today. I feel somewhat responsible for the technical glitch because I got on our little test call today and immediately said, every time we do a Zoom call, there's a tech glitch. Every time I do a Zoom call, there's a tech glitch. So it's lovely to speak to you all, Lucy Peck. Before I get started, I wanted to do an acknowledgement of country. So I'm coming to you today from Gadigal land, and I just want to acknowledge elders past, present, and emerging, and just acknowledge that sovereignty was never ceded, always was, always will be Aboriginal land. And I want to pay my respects to any Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander people who may be with us on the call today. So, as Chris mentioned, I'm going to be speaking to you about GHB today. So specifically about the GHB cultures, practices, and experiences study. A little bit more about me before we get there. So as Chris mentioned, I work at ACON, and ACON is an organization specializing in the health and well-being of sexuality and gender diverse communities here in New South Wales. More commonly understood terminology to connote sexuality and gender diverse communities might be LGBTQ. And I'm also enrolled at the Kirby Institute as a PhD student. And my PhD research is really looking at community-led and peer-based responses to sexualized drug use. And the study that I'm going to talk about today is a foundational part of my PhD research program. It's a study that was funded by the National Centre for Clinical Research on Emerging Drugs. I've been working really closely on this study with Krista Seafried, who I believe is also on the call. And we also conducted this study in partnership with Thorn Harbour Health and WAC, who are similar organisations to ACON, but who work in Victoria and Western Australia. I just want to say as well that when I'm talking about the GHB cultures, practices, and experiences study today, I'm going to be talking a little bit about sexual violence. And I just wanted to flag that because I know this can be a really sensitive topic for some people. So I wanted to give you that warning in advance. Before I get on to talking about the cultures, practices, and experiences study, I'm going to talk a little bit about what GHB is. So GHB stands for gamma hydroxybutyrate. Its precursors are GBL and 1,4-BD. It was historically used as a bodybuilding supplement and a sleep aid, but it's had a recreational use from about the 1990s. And today it's often used for sex, socializing, and partying because it can induce feelings of euphoria and relaxation and disinhibition, and can also increase libido. When GHB is taken recreationally at high doses, it becomes a central nervous system depressant. So it slows down breathing and heart rate. And as a drug, it can be extracted from ingredients in cleaning agents and industrial solvents. It's usually sold as a liquid and usually referred to as G. Other terminology relating to GHB is charging, which refers to dosing on GHB, dropping or blowing out, which refers to GHB overdose. So it's a really whistle-stop top-line tour of what GHB is. I want to give you a little bit of context about GHB in Australia in terms of prevalence of use. So among the Australian population, we see a relatively low prevalence of GHB use. 0.1% of people report GHB use in the last 12 months. And that stat's taken from the Australian Institute of Health and Welfare's National Drug Strategy Household Survey from 2019. But we know that GHB is used at higher rates among some subpopulations. And I'm mentioning this To put into context why an organisation like ACON, who works with sexuality and gender diverse communities, is particularly interested in GHB, because in an Australian context, we see that 5.4% of gay and bisexual men and 2% of lesbian, bisexual and queer women have used GHB in the previous 6 months. Among trans and gender diverse people, we see that 15.8% of people report sexualized drug use in the previous 12 months. So we know that G is a drug which is popularly used to enhance sex. And so it's reasonable to suspect that some of that sexualized drug use being reported by trans people is accounted for by GHB use. In terms of the harms that may be experienced by in relation to GHB, I want to acknowledge that, not everyone who uses G necessarily experiences harms. However, there is a high risk to experience some GHB-related harms that I've outlined on this slide. So I think anytime you read or talk about GHB, you hear about GHB overdose. And that's because GHB presents quite a high risk for overdose. And that's because there can be variations in tolerance to GHB between individuals, and one individual can have different tolerances to GHB at different points in their life. There can be variations in the strength and purity of GHB between batches. And GHB also has a steep dose response curve. Now, what that means is that there's a really small margin of error between a dose of GHB, which might create a desired experience of a GHB high, and a dose of GHB, which might create a GHB-induced coma. The other thing which presents a risk for GHB overdose is combining GHB with other depressants, other central nervous system depressants, such as alcohol or benzodiazepines. So while there's a low prevalence of GHB use in the general population, GHB accounts for a high number of ambulance attendances and emergency department presentations. There's been some research that has come out of Victoria recently looking at GHB-related ambulance attendances. And that research from Victoria found a 147% increase in GHB-related ambulance attendances between the years of 2012 and 2018. Sexual violence is another harm, which is sometimes reported in relation to GHB use. And the reason why this might be reported is because GHB is a drug which decreases inhibitions and increases sex drive. So people often report great pleasure associated with GHB sex. However, GHB can also induce coma and induce amnesia. And it's because of these properties that have led to associations of GHB as a date rape drug. And some studies have reported GHB facilitated sexual violence. And the final harm I'm going to mention there has to do with dependence and withdrawal. So there's a common misconception among people who use GHB that you can't become dependent on GHB, which is not true. If you're using GHB daily or multiple times a day, it does carry a risk for physiological dependence. And when you stop using GHB, you're likely to experience withdrawal symptoms, and a supervised withdrawal is recommended. I'm not going to speak so much about dependence and withdrawal today. That's largely because the study that we did on the GHB cultures, practices and experiences study, we didn't collect much data about dependence and withdrawal. And also Krista, who worked on the GHB cultures, practices and experiences study with me, is going to speak about dependence and withdrawal, I think, at this meeting, GHB dependence and withdrawal at this meeting in a couple of weeks' time. So the GHB cultures, practices and experiences study, that was the context that I wanted to give you to frame up where we were coming at this study from. I'm going to tell you what the study was, what we did and what we found. So the study was conducted to inform service-based responses and address gaps in the qualitative evidence base about GHB and LGBTQ communities. That first point there about it being conducted to inform service-based responses is really key. So my background is working in health promotion and harm reduction education and doing some outreach work with medical teams at large music festivals and events. And during my work doing outreach at large music festivals and events, I responded to a lot of GHB overdose. ACON as an organisation is particularly invested in delivering services to educate people around GHB, and we also have client services in drug and alcohol as well. And Thorn Harbour Health and WAC are also similar. So we really approached this research with a pragmatic frame. And we wanted to understand the perceived benefits and harms of GHB use. We wanted to document practices of knowledge sharing, self-regulation and harm reduction. And we also wanted to explore experiences of GHB overdose, dependence, and withdrawal. So what did we do? We did this as a qualitative study, and we recruited 31 participants via social media. We used the social media channels of ACON, Thorn Harbour Health, and WAC predominantly. And we recruited people who reported 3 or more occasions of GHB use in the last 12 months, who lived in Australia and who identified as LGBTQ. We did this study with semi-structured interviews, and we asked questions relating to the context, settings, practices, and experiences of GHB use. And our questions really focused on harm reduction, knowledge and practice, sex practices and communication, and the experience of GHB overdose. We charted the data to a thematic framework and analysed it using a framework methodology. So I'm going to talk you through now what we found and who participated. So you'll see there in our sample, we had a wide range of ages. I think our youngest participant was 19 and our oldest participant was 62. You'll notice there in the GHB use frequency section of that slide, we see that we had 3 participants who are using GHB 3 or 4 times a week, some who are using weekly, fortnightly, or monthly, and then a number who are using sporadically, but more than 3 times a year or every couple of months. What's important to note there is that we didn't have anyone in this sample who was using GHB daily or multiple times a day. So our data for the GHB cultures, practices, and experiences study doesn't really address GHB dependence or GHB withdrawal. In terms of the sexual orientation of our participants, a number were gay or queer, bisexual. We had 2 lesbians who participated and 2 heterosexual people. The heterosexual people who participated were both trans women. And then in terms of the gender identities, the most commonly represented gender identity there is cisgender men, non-binary people, 7, cisgender women, we had 6 cis women, trans women we had 3, and trans men we just had 1. And then the other bit of context I'll provide around our participants was that most were born in Australia or the United Kingdom and spoke English as a first language. I'm going to paint for you a picture of our overall findings and then speak in some more detail about some of the themes which we noticed. So in alignment with other research that's been done among people who are using GHB, we saw that there were 3 contexts of GHB use reported. Predominantly, we saw GHB being used at home. So people were using G at house parties, at dinner parties, at small gatherings, at private sex parties, or just on TV, on the couch when they're watching TV. We also saw that most people in our study were using GHB for sex, which was an interesting finding because a lot of the evidence base about GHB and sexuality in gender diverse populations documents a practice of sexualized GHB use among gay and bisexual men. And in our study, we found that regardless of sexuality or gender identity, people were using G for sex. So I think about 28 out of our 31 participants reported they used G for sex. And the types of sex that people were reporting were casual sex, relationship sex, group sex, sex at beats or saunas, or at private ticketed sex parties. And then finally, GHB is a club drug, and this was reported among our sample as well. Less often reported at use at clubs and at festivals than at home. However, still many people in our sample did report using GHB for the purposes of dancing at clubs and festivals. In terms of polydrug use, GHB is rarely used on its own, as we see in other research, and this played out in our sample as well. Most people reported combining GHB with other drugs, and the context of drug use really determined what the polydrug use looked like as well. So among gay and bisexual men who are using GHB for casual sex, they were commonly combining GHB with the use of crystal methamphetamine. GHB, when it was used at clubs and at festivals, was often combined with the use of MDMA. And some people in our sample reported routinely combining GHB with alcohol. I would say there were some younger people in our sample who reported that they routinely combined GHB with alcohol. And they reported that while acknowledging that the education they'd received from peers and from health promotion organizations was that that was a very dangerous thing to do. So there was a knowledge about it, but still a continued practice of combining G with alcohol in a minority of circumstances, I would say. The other thing I'll say here is that GHB was rarely dosed just once over an occasion of use. GHB is a drug which was dosed multiple times. And the size of a dose varied between individuals. So some people reported dosing about 0.5 ml as a standard. Other people in our sample reported dosing 3 ml as a standard dose. And there were a variety of factors which may have affected the size of a GHB dose. So those are some overall findings. And I now want to speak to a kind of narrative which characterizes in broad brushstrokes the data that we collected about GHB. And we've reflected this narrative in a paper that we've just published in the International Journal of Drug Policy, and that paper's linked at the top of that slide. And the narrative kind of goes like this, is that people really enjoyed using GHB. They associated it with a range of different pleasures, and they reported a diverse range of motivations to use GHB. People said that GHB didn't result in come downs or hangovers like other drugs. They thought that GHB was relatively affordable. People really liked the short half-life of GHB, so you can use GHB and then it can be excreted from your system, or you can no longer feel the effects of it within 2 hours. And some people like that it enabled them to experience a kind of expedited high and then to get on with the obligations of their day, or go to sleep and function. But people really loved the experience of the GHB high as well, describing it with terminology of relaxation and disinhibition, euphoria, and aphrodisiac. So while there was this widespread appreciation of G as a drug, there was also an acknowledgement that GHB carries several risks. And the most commonly articulated risk was this risk of GHB overdose. And there was an acknowledgement among all participants that GHB overdose could result in death or loss of consciousness, hospitalization, overdose symptoms such as nausea or vomiting, or accident or injury. So I'd say that GHB overdose was really front of mind for people when they were narrating their experiences on GHB. And also front of mind for people was a sense that in order to experience the pleasure of using GHB and to mitigate risks around overdose, you have to be really careful with how you practice your harm reduction and how you practice your control strategies. And we saw a number of really good control strategies being reported among our sample. So those control strategies might be considered at the stages of preparing for GHB use and then the actual occasion of GHB use itself. So in the preparation stage, people articulated the importance of educating yourself, talking to your peers and educating them. Some people reported using reagent test kits for GHB. Other people reported on the importance of getting reviews of particular GHB batches from dealers and friends who they're sourcing GHB from. In terms of the occasion of GHB use, it was reported that it was really important to control how you're dosing your G, being really meticulous with how you measure your GHB, how you time your intervals between doses on G, and you also need to be really careful about what other drugs that you're using alongside GHB, with nearly everyone reporting that they knew you're not supposed to combine GHB with other central nervous system depressants like alcohol or benzos. If you want to read more about the harm reduction strategies, I'll circulate these slides, and in the bottom of the slide there's a link with some more detail about the harm reduction strategies that were reported. I've chosen a number of quotes to demonstrate this narrative which emerged. And the first quote there has to do with pleasure. And it comes from Emily, who was a trans woman who was queer in her 20s. And she said to me, it being GHB has a distinct effect on my dysphoria, more so than any drug that I've ever taken. It really does allow me not to feel dysphoric. There's something about it that allows that part of my brain that is almost always kind of like active to chill out. And I feel very congruent with my body in a way that I'm not used to 99% of the time. Now, there are a number of quotes that I could have chosen from that really demonstrate this experience of GHB and pleasure, but I chose this quote from Emily because a number of our trans and gender diverse participants reported that GHB had this distinct effect on gender dysphoria and affirming gender identity and experiencing that confidence. And I thought that was a really interesting finding from this particular sample of people who are using GHB. Other pleasures associated with GHB were covered in the previous slide. In terms of risk, I like this quote from Craig, who was a cisgender gay man in his 50s, who spoke about that really narrow margin of error when it comes to dosing your GHB. So Craig says, you only need to be a little bit out here, 1 mil either way. It can be the difference between having a good time and or, getting sent to hospital. It's quite a simple quote, but it reflects a notion that nearly everybody in our study articulated, was that you need to be really careful with your dosing, and if you're not, you may experience GHB overdose. And then finally, I just like the way that Jose characterized this notion of control and the importance of controlling GHB in terms of harm reduction. And Jose said, I really enjoy G. I think it's my favorite drug to do. Apart from those 2 incidents when I was young, I've never ever had a bad incident since then. And I attribute that to the fact that I control my usage. So that characterizes how people thought about control and the importance of controlling GHB usage. And the other thing which Jose reflects upon there is 2 incidents when he was young. Now, this was a common narrative that played out among our participants, which highlighted that people who are new to using GHB or people who are younger were particularly vulnerable to GHB overdose due to lack of knowledge. And I think that's a nice segue for us to then talk about some education needs that are highlighted from our study here around GHB and harm reduction. Because despite exercising a number of really strong control strategies, most people in our sample had experienced GHB overdose, as is consistent with many other studies among GHB users. So I've got some specific learning that I think we need to pay attention to as people who are providing services. So the first one there being that younger people who are new to using GHB are susceptible to GHB overdose due to lack of knowledge. I won't read out Ben's quote there because I feel that Jose's quote kind of captures it quite nicely. Another education need was around really inconsistent understandings about the differences between GHB and GBL. So you might remember from my first slide there that I spoke about GBL being a precursor to GHB that converts to GHB in the body. And across our sample, there was a sense that there was no consistent narrative about the difference between GHB and GBL. Some people reporting that GBL was stronger, some people reporting that GHB was stronger. People had different ideas about the thickness of GHB, some reporting that it was thicker than GBL, some reporting that it was thinner than GBL, and the taste. There was a very confusing array of reports about the differences between GHB and GBL. And I think this is demonstrated by Craig, who said here, he's talking about sourcing GHB and asking the person if it's GHB or GBL. And he says, some people, they generally will know. Sometimes they don't know. So you run the risk of it being GBL, GBH. If you can't remember which one's which, then I always remember GBL. The L stands for longer and the H is the shorter one. Could be wrong there. I think Craig's quote there, which is a little bit confused, reflects a lot of the confusion about the differences between GHB and GBL among our participant sample. And the reason why it's important is because people were making decisions about how much they would dose based on whether they thought they were having GBL or GHB. And when we've got a substance like GHB where the margin of error in terms of the dosing is so narrow, you don't want to be making decisions on the basis of dosing, on the basis of incorrect information. So I think that we need to do a little bit of education around the differences between GHB and GBL, while also just adhering to that universal drug harm reduction principle of starting low and going slow, waiting to feel the effects of any particular batch, and then titrating from there. I've mentioned earlier about the vulnerability to overdose among people who are new to using GHB. We also saw vulnerability to overdose among people who were more experienced of using GHB, people who felt they had a really good grasp or knowledge about GHB harm reduction, and really good practice around GHB harm reduction too. And among overdose experienced by those with more experience around GHB use, they often rationalize that experience in relation to not adhering to the rules on one particular occasion of use and not adhering to the rules around polydrug use specifically. And I think this is nicely summarized by Martin here, who says, by the time you'd done 4 lines of Coke or 4 mils of G, a couple of bumps, you were so out of it that everyone, I mean, you might have a plan to do this sequence at this time, put your timer on for your G, but then I just remember it was all bets were off. Just do whatever the hell you want. So this quote from Martin captures that notion of getting carried away in the heat of the moment and straying from what you'd previously agreed with yourself about your control strategies around your GHB use. And several people recounted this experience. So when we think about education need in response to this, I think we need to promote and think about how we can encourage controlled GHB use throughout an entire occasion of GHB use. I'm going to move on now to talk about GHB and this notion of connection. And I'm going to lead out this section by saying that GHB is a drug that was predominantly used with other people. It's a social drug. Only 2 participants in our sample reported using GHB alone, and those participants suggested that those occasions of using GHB alone was an anomaly. They were exceptional circumstances. So GHB was nearly always used with other people. And when people thought about who they were using GHB with, they thought of their GHB using peers as supporting safety and supporting the enjoyment of GHB use. So that was largely the narrative around GHB using peers. A big motivator to use GHB was this motivator of a sense of GHB enabling profound connection. So it was said to create experiences of great sex, to enable people to explore their sexual identities and their sexual boundaries, create intimacy and communication, enable people to receive care from their loved ones in ways which felt really meaningful, and to form new relationships. I think we see that type of connection across a variety of drug types, but people really emphasize this about GHB in particular. Again, acknowledgement of the pleasure of connection associated with GHB was tempered with an acknowledgement of risk. So people suggested that there can be risks from other people who you're using GHB with, and those risks relate to sexual violence, relationship breakdowns, traumas associated with responding to overdose, peer pressure around the amount of G you're using, and also spiking or intentional GHB overdose being enacted by somebody else. So to control for those risks, people reported that they would only use GHB with select and trusted friends, that some people had really robust practices around negotiation, around drug consumption and their own sexual boundaries, and careful approaches to selecting who they would have GHB sex with. People also reported gatekeeping strategies where they would distance themselves from people who were perceived to be reckless or unsafe around their GHB use. So those were often people who weren't exercising appropriate control or caution around their GHB dosing, potentially doing things like free pouring their GHB. And the other reported practice was about regulating each other's practices around dosing, measuring, and timing, and polydrug use in GHB to increase that experience of safety. To characterize that notion of connection with a couple of quotes, I just want to highlight Tracy's quote here. So Tracy was a trans woman who was heterosexual in her 30s, and she said, "The connection is an important part of the reason I think most people take GHB. And while you might find it reduced to it makes sex great, the connection can be so much deeper than without it in a way that most people don't recognize as depth. this sort of sentiment was repeated by multiple people in the study. To characterize that notion of risk that I spoke about there, I'm going to quote Jermaine, who said, "My first GHB encounter was non-consensual, and that was, I dare say, an overdose, and I was taken advantage of." So Jermaine in that instance is referring to an incidence of GHB drink spiking, which then led to an incident of sexual violence. And then finally there, how do we control for risk, interpersonal risk around GHB use? And I think this quote from Alina is a nice one. So Alina says, "I'll have a beer with anyone." And then it sort of narrows down to, I'll do MD with these people, I'll do mushrooms with these people, and I'll do G with these people. It's kind of like a narrow pyramid of trust. Alina implying there that people who they'll use GHB with are at the top of that pyramid of trust. It wasn't an intention of this study to explore in detail sex and consent on GHB. However, as we did the interviews, nearly all of our participants reported they were combining GHB with sex. And so that led us to ask a number of questions about how people were approaching communication throughout the entire process of GHB sex. So we were asking people questions about how they articulated and negotiated their sexual boundaries and the sexual boundaries of other people, both before and during GHB sex. And we found some interesting things. In our sample, people acknowledged that GHB, it was a drug that's used to explore sexuality, that it disinhibits you sexually, and that it therefore can enable new sexual possibilities, and you can push your sexual boundaries in GHB in a way that some people really valued and thought was a beautiful, affirming thing. But in acknowledgement of that, people also thought that it was really important to be having conversations ahead of GHB use and ahead of sex to establish your sexual boundaries and establish what your sexual limits are as well. And I thought that was a really promising practice. People would set up a framework for a sexual encounter of GHB sex ahead of time, which would then inform the type of sex they might have with a person once they met, consumed GHB and started having sex. However, there was an acknowledgement that as a drug which disinhibits, that upon starting GHB sex, we might push our boundaries or explore new territory which we hadn't previously discussed. Which leads us on to the next finding there, which is that less commonly reported were accounts of continuous verbal communication to ensure sexual consent throughout GHB sex. I think that it's important that we reflect on that, because we know that sexual consent is fluid, and sex with drug use combined, consent can be even more fluid. And I think that the finding there demonstrates to us that we need to promote and normalize practices of continuous verbal consent throughout GHB sex, and normalize practices of checking in for consent verbally. Some people in our study were people who identified with kink and BDSM communities who were also reporting GHB sex. And they reported that they were using communication strategies throughout GHB sex to ensure consent. And they reported that they learned to use these strategies from kink or BDSM communities, which they narrated that these communities have quite robust and nuanced, evolved peer education processes around consent. And I think there's some learning from our participants engaged in kink and BDSM communities about how they negotiate continuous consent in the context of GHB sex. So people were reporting that they were using things like traffic light signaling. So during a GHB sexual encounter, if someone said green, it meant they were really enjoying themselves. If someone said orange, it meant they weren't so sure, maybe slow down, change up the sexual activity in some way. Or if they said red, it meant stop all sex immediately because the person wasn't comfortable. Final thing I wanted to reflect on there about sexual boundaries in communication was that several people in our study did report experiences of distressing sex on GHB, but typically resisted labeling these experiences as sexual violence and did not access sexual violence services. I think what that tells us is that we need to engage some education to help people who are engaged in GHB sex to recognize and respond to sexual violence if it occurs, and that our service-based responses targeting folks who are using GHB for sex need to encourage people to access services to talk through experiences of using GHB for sex that they may find distressing, regardless of whether they label them as sexual violence. The final theme I wanted to talk through from our data has to do with overdose response. So I've spoken already in the presentation today about GHB overdose being a common experience among people who use G, and this was reflected in our sample as well. So in our sample, 18 people had personally lost consciousness after using GHB, and 17 had witnessed someone who had lost consciousness after using GHB. And only 6 of our participants reported that they hadn't experienced either of those things. So this finding, I think, aligns with multiple other studies conducted among people who use GHB. And every time that you read about GHB, you read about GHB overdose, but there hasn't been so much attention paid in research to how people understand overdose or how people respond to GHB overdose. So when we asked people about how they understood what GHB overdose was, we heard a range of things reported. And I think this quote from Mark summarizes a little bit about how people thought about GHB overdose. So Mark was a cisgender gay man in his 30s, and he says, there's a different level of overdose, I think. Like some people just fall asleep and they're fine. Seems like they've just gone into a deep sleep. But then when you start seeing those really cold sweats, and sometimes there's no way of waking them up when they just go to sleep, and you can still get a mumble or whatnot out of them if you poke and prod them. So that was Mark's account of GHB overdose. And I think what he's referring to there are kind of, in a way, 3 different strata of GHB overdose, which we also see reflected in the literature or evidence base about GHB overdose. So when we look at the literature about GHB overdose, there's variable definitions. Some studies distinguish between this notion of G napping or a GHB sleep induced by GHB versus comatose intoxication. So that comatose intoxication being when someone's completely non-responsive, they don't react to pain or sound stimuli, and they don't move for a certain period of time. Whereas some studies define overdose in alignment with a range of signs and symptoms of overdose, such as vomiting, contortions, sweating, regardless of whether those signs and symptoms are then followed by the experience of either a GHB sleep or a GHB-induced coma. And I think we see elements of each of those kind of definitions of overdose reflected in Mark's quote there. Like I say, there's been very little research conducted about how people respond to GHB overdose in community-based settings, even though we know that most occurrences of GHB overdose are not managed within hospital-based settings. So this is a bit of an analysis that we're doing of our data currently about how did people respond to witness GHB overdose. And really in this part of the presentation, I just want to report to you what people did, the descriptions of what people did. So we can see there on the left-hand side of the column, we've got the stage of overdose, the response, and the specific actions that people took. So initial signs and symptoms, this might be at the stage where someone's experiencing what Mark describes as the vomiting or the cold sweats. And during that stage, people reported they were doing things like checking in, asking if you're okay, asking people if they need to take a break, removing hazards from the immediate environment, and removing stimulus. So potentially turning off music, changing the lighting, or moving someone to a more comfortable location. During that stage of GHB overdose, whereby we might see a near loss of consciousness or sleeping, that kind of G napping, which was referred to in that overdose definition, people talked about a range of strategies that they used to keep someone alert. So in terms of strategies, we saw noise and pain stimulus, standing people under a shower, biting nipples, rubbing sternums, shouting at people, shaking, slapping or hitting, throwing water on someone or keeping someone upright. Also, during that state of nearly losing consciousness or that uncontrollable urge to sleep after using GHB, people talked about how they dosed other drugs and fluids to try and keep people alert. So people would dose cocaine, people would dose crystal methamphetamine, people reported providing that person with orange juice or putting a lemon or lime wedge in their mouth. And then at the stage of lost consciousness, so this is referring to a stage whereby someone is unrousable after using GHB. And what do people do in these circumstances? So people said that they would just observe. They would sit with someone for hours, and sometimes they would intermittently monitor them. So they might put them in another room and just check on them occasionally. People reported that they would assess vitals. So they might monitor for their breathing, sounds, and patterns. They might take their temperature or check their heart rate. People reported that they would manage their airways by placing someone in the recovery position. There was a large emphasis on this often happening around groups of people. So the sense of collaboration was really key here. We talked with other people about how we might be able to hold someone upright, how we might be able to make decisions with each other about whether or not we're going to call 000 for help, or how we might carry the dead weight of somebody's body to a different location. And then finally there, I've got getting help. And I've got another slide on this coming up. But sometimes people made decisions to call 000. Sometimes people drove people to emergency departments, or sometimes people put people in an Uber to go, or took people in an Uber to go to an emergency department, which undoubtedly probably would affect your Uber rating, but I didn't ask about that so much. The last thing I'm going to talk about before I think we have some time for Q&A is about factors which influenced people's decisions to call for 000. Now, on the left side of this slide, I've got factors which seem to influence people to not call for 000 in response to a GHB overdose. In the middle, stuff that could have gone either way. And on the right-hand side of the slide, we've got circumstances which might increase the likelihood of someone calling for 000. So people reported that they might not call 000 because of previous experiences of stigma and discrimination in hospital-based settings about being people who use drugs. People reported they were less likely to call 000 if they knew the person really well. So this was that sense that I know this person, they do this all the time. I've seen this several times before. They always come back and I don't need to call an ambulance for them because this is just kind of what they're capable of and it's going to be fine. Cost was a barrier to calling 000, particularly for some of our younger participants. The environment in which overdose took place was a big factor for a number of people. This was largely in relation to overdose that might have taken place at somebody else's house, or an environment in which the participant didn't feel that they had personal agency or control or authority to call 000 to that particular location. Police co-attendance and onwards legal ramifications was another concern which prevented people from calling 000. And this sense that someone seemed to be breathing normally was another thing which people narrated as a reason for not calling 000 as well. Things which could have gone either way was this feeling of control. Now that seemed to largely be to do with how experienced the respondent was with GHB overdose. As someone who had experienced a number of GHB overdoses before and had managed them and not called 000 might have been less likely, might have felt more in control and been less likely to call 000 in that instance. Other people, in some circumstances, other people were reported to put pressure to not call 000. Other people who were deemed to be more experienced with GHB overdose, who had hesitations about ambulance and police co-attendants, put pressure on the participant who kind of otherwise would have called 000 to then not call 000. And in some circumstances, the participant reported really collaborating with other people there to collectively make a decision to call 000. The third thing which could have gone either way, there was this notion of what would I want for myself? And this was articulated a few times, being among people who had experienced overdose themselves previously, who had sort of said, you know, I've experienced this a number of times previously and I've not had to go to hospital. And I'm really grateful to the people who I was with that they didn't call 000 in that incident, because I didn't have to deal with the rigmarole of going to hospital. However, had I been in serious trouble, I really would have wanted them to call 000. And that's kind of the logic that they applied when they were making decisions about whether to call 000 for other people as well. I think what that highlights is what is the yardstick for serious trouble, and how are we making that assessment, which is something that I think we need to pay attention to. Circumstances which influence decisions to call 000 was person not being responsive. Some people articulated that as their absolute benchmark. You know, if you can't rouse someone, if you can't get a response out of them, even if they appear to be breathing normally, I'm still going to call 000. On 3 occasions, people reported that they were with people who accidentally ingested GHB. So GHB, being a clear liquid that is normally orally ingested, can easily be mistaken for water or another liquid that you can drink. And on 3 occasions, that was reported among my sample. And on all 3 of those occasions, people immediately called 000. All right, so wrapping up. As I said at the start of this presentation, this research was really conducted to inform the responses of community-based organizations providing services and delivering harm reduction education and peer education to people who are using GHB. I've organized this presentation along sort of 3 major findings or 3 theme areas, and I think there's some things to learn about each of those 3 theme areas. So in regards to harm reduction and control, I think we want to reinforce strengths in practice that we've observed around dosing, measuring, timing, using with trusted friends, and regulating your peer group's use of GHB and polydrug use as well. I think there's some education that needs to take place to target people who are new to using GHB. Among people who are experienced with GHB, we need to promote control with regards to polydrug use throughout an entire occasion of use. And I think we want to educate about the differences between GBL, GHB, and 1,4-BD, whilst continuing to promote that age-old sentiment of start low and go slow. In terms of GHB sex boundaries and communications, I think we really want to reinforce some of those positive practices that we observed about pre-sex communication, but we also want to promote continuous verbal consent throughout GHB sex. And we also need to impart some education around recognizing, naming, and responding to sexual violence if it occurs, and accessing sexual violence services if necessary. And the final thing there is about overdose response. I think we want to continue to encourage people to call 000 in response to GHB overdose. However, I think our findings reveal that there are a number of barriers that people articulate to calling 000, and we need to acknowledge that not everyone will always call 000 in response to a GHB overdose. And so to reduce harms in that instance, we need to provide education on how we can appropriately manage airways and how we might be able to appropriately assess vitals. And then finally, I think there's some work to do around addressing barriers to ambulance calls where possible. So there might be some policy implications around police co-attendance, whether there's things we can do around the cost of ambulance, and inclusive practice-based initiatives at hospital-based settings around people who use drugs. That is kind of what I wanted to say today. And I just want to thank you for having me, but I also want to just thank and acknowledge the 31 people who were super generous with me and with the study and sharing their experiences and their time with us. And this study has been supported by 3 organizations, which I've mentioned, and also a really large research team. And I want to thank that research team with particular thanks to Krista Fried and the National Center for Clinical Research on Emerging Drugs. And there's a couple of outputs there that I can send through to the group as well. One of them is a little video summary of our findings, but you've just got a way more detailed account of some of our findings in the presentation today. So thank you so much. I hope I didn't talk too much. I think we've got about 10 minutes or so for questions if people have them.
Thanks very much, Jack. And a very interesting presentation around GHB and sex. And I think I mean, just interesting. I mean, the thing I was sort of really interested about was this concept of GHB sex and consent, which obviously adds another layer of complexity to sexual consent, which is a huge issue, not just for GHB, but obviously for alcohol and a range of other drugs as well, especially. Yeah, I mean, there's more to it than that, and I won't linger on that one. One question I did want to ask about was just, well, there's actually two. I'll wait for other people. I'll let other people chime in with their questions. So, so please do put them in. But while people are just generating a few questions, predominantly were the people that you recruited from metropolitan, I'm assuming mostly from metropolitan Sydney?
Yeah, so they were from predominantly Sydney, Melbourne, and Perth. So I'd say most were from Sydney or Melbourne. We had 3 participants from rural and regional parts. So 2 of those were in New South Wales and 1 of those was in Victoria. Yeah, but predominantly quite LGBTQ community attached people in metropolitan areas, recruited via those organizations' social media accounts. Yeah.
No. Look, the reason I mentioned that, we do have a variety of LHDs also here today from regional areas, and it's, look, I must say, most of the time when I ask patients about their GHB use in those sort of communities, most of them say, "What's that?" But have you any insights onto whether or not this is something that's starting to infiltrate into more regional communities and so forth?
I personally don't. I can't answer that question.
No, that's fine. No, not a problem.
I wish I could tell you, but I can't. I can see that Krista has her hand up there, and I don't know if Krista, you wanted to come in on that point or if you wanted to come in on something else.
I guess one of the things I just wanted to come in on, just thinking about that and reflecting on the people who are on this call, we did target people who use GHB who identify as LGBTQ for the study that Jack just presented, but we are actually seeking to replicate those findings in other people. People who do not identify as LGBTQ. So we're looking at cis and trans heterosexual folks and hoping that they will participate in a similar series of interviews. So there are some details on our website, but we are hoping that if you have any clients that you think may be eligible, we would love if you would refer them on to the study. And you can reach out to myself or Jack or if you want further details. So I just wanted to put that little plug in there.
No, that's great. Thank you, Krista.
It is a different population.
Yeah, absolutely. So thank you for that. And is that link in the chat? Sorry.
Oh, put it there now.
Put it there now, please. I had a question on the chat here. Well, firstly, thanks for a great talk. GHB and CMA are commonly used together. Is GHB used to come down from CMA, or do they enhance each other?
Yeah, that's a great question. So frequently, I would say both is the answer to that. Frequently, GHB was reported in combination with crystal methamphetamine being used sort of immediately after the crystal methamphetamine. So you'd use the crystal meth and then maybe half an hour later you use your GHB, and often kind of follow that regime of dosing, or you might have a couple of doses of GHB, but then you'd wait a little bit after your next dose of crystal meth and then have GHB after. And then I'd say that also people were occasionally reporting the use of GHB for its sleep-inducing effect after they'd been using other stimulants. And so, yeah, the sense that if you've been partying all weekend using stimulants, then you might taper off using stimulants towards the end of the weekend and use GHB, knowing that you're going to be able to get a good sleep on your GHB. So, yeah, I would say so.
Thanks, Jack, and thanks, Chris, for the question. And Krista has shared that link there, which I imagine one half hour in ED at St Vincent's, and we'd probably have enough recruitment for your study if
so Chris, actually we don't. That's actually not
what
happening. Yes.
Oh, okay.
We've been in ED and Panda every day. So
oh gosh, okay.
so I don't know, there have been recent market disruptions in supply, so it could be perhaps that people are consuming less GHB at the moment, but there have been a few potential participants, patients in Panda that we have discussed it with, who we've asked if we could ring them back after they've left hospital, and unfortunately we haven't been able to contact them. But far fewer potential participants than what we had hoped from that recruitment stream. And we also have sites at RPA and Concord. So just to put that out there, much appreciated if anybody can strum up any interest.
No, thank you, Krista. And I must say on that, I do always have some semblance of when there is a market disruption. There tends to be a flurry of presentations for withdrawal, and typically one of the 4 withdrawal people reportedly in withdrawal is in custody at the time, and then we don't see any for a while. And it sort of does come in bursts like that, which I've noticed as well.
Yeah, it's interesting.
What was I going to say? Coming back to Jack, I had another question. And this, because I think this is a question across not just GHB use, but other drug substance use and overdose. Were there any legal issues that people had after calling the police? I mean, my understanding is the police won't attend, or shouldn't be attending these with ambulances unless it's at a pre-flagged place of potential concern from the paramedics. That's my understanding, and I'm happy for other people to obviously jump in on that. But we're just wondering if anybody had mentioned if there are any legal ramifications, because certainly I don't call the police on anybody. The doctors are certainly not police officers, and so it's not. I don't care. We don't report anyone, and paramedics similarly, unless they're threatened themselves, are not going to be doing anything. So just any thoughts on that?
The overriding perception was that when you call 000 for something to do with an overdose, that police might attend. And that they do, and that there was a sense that you didn't want that. But nobody in the sample reported any adverse interactions with police about drugs specifically. One participant reported about police co-attendance during a mental health occasion of ambulance attendants, and that made them feel very uncomfortable, which then influenced their onwards decision to ever call 000 again. But the answer to your question to that is no. Nobody reported anything about police prosecution after calling 000.
Okay. And look, I imagine, I guess also if the person putting in the call had mentioned that they were concerned, for example, if it had been a stranger on the street or something, obviously they may well have flagged 000 that perhaps the person was acting unusually or something like that, and perhaps required police as well. Anyway, that's a bigger issue for another day. Chris Davis, you have your hand up. Did you have something you wanted to ask? If we can get
me, there's something wrong with everything, right? I'm not Lucy Peck. I'm Nadine.
Yes, sorry, Nadine. I almost called you Lucy. Yes, every single person who's logged on has unfortunately come up as Lucy. If you can change, your name with it.
But I'm saying maybe it's me that's got my hand up.
You both do. So, but by all means.
Okay. I guess, Jack, one of the things that we hear a lot, or occasionally, is that people might keep some methamphetamine, or someone sees themselves as kind of a bush doctor and keeps methamphetamine to reverse GHB overdoses. I noticed you mentioned some of the other techniques like lemon juice. I guess my question to you is that something that participants spoke of, reversing a GHB overdose with methamphetamine? And what would your recommendation to us as clinicians be when people say that's what they do?
Look, it was reported a couple of times, and it was reported cocaine, I think, was more frequently reported than crystal methamphetamine dosing, bumps of cocaine. In terms of advice to you as clinicians regarding that, I don't know what the advice is. I don't know. I really would like to talk to you more about that to figure out kind of what the contraindications are and the relative safety of that.
Did your participants say, and it worked, or and it didn't work?
I think the narrative was that it I'd need to look again. There's a couple of cases off the top of my head that I'm thinking of whereby 000 wasn't called and the situation resolved. But it wasn't like this sense of we dosed this and it was a miracle cure. It was we dosed this, we did a whole bunch of other things and we didn't call 000.
Okay. Because it's about community beliefs too. I mean, we can say what we like. We've been saying what we like a lot of time. Drugs are dangerous to us, you know. So it would be good to hear some collective experience and attitude around it. That's all.
Yeah, but I also want to know like what the clinical advice is. Like, what do you say? Like, is there a clear?
Usually we say if someone's overdosed on one drug, adding in more drugs, or if someone is in trouble in the context of using drugs, even if it looks really like an overdose, usually adding in more substances risks making things worse, not better.
Yeah.
But also kind of biochemically it shouldn't work.
I've obviously never watched that episode of Seinfeld where they put cookies in the mouth of a collapsed person because they might be hypoglycemic.
I haven't seen it.
What was I going to say? The Wolf of Wall Street as well. Yes, that particular scene that I'm sure everybody knows what I'm talking about if you've seen the movie. I couldn't encourage you to see it. He's an awful person and doesn't need to be glorified. What was I going to say? Chris Davis has put his hand down, but I'll give him an opportunity to jump on. If he had any questions, let us know. While just for, what was I going to say? Otherwise, but no, I don't think Chris has got any other questions. He's already... an accidental hand raised, no worries. Thanks very much. Well, look, if that's all of the questions, please join with me in thanking Jack for a really interesting talk, and good luck with all of your future research endeavors in this very interesting and emerging space.
Thank you. Thanks so much for having me.
Absolute pleasure.
Thank you.
See you later.